You're following a damn dog into the woods at this hour." The old man's voice cracked through the cold evening air like a twig snapping underfoot, but Daniel barely turned his head. The mutt, a wiry mud-caked creature with ribs pressing through its matted fur, was moving fast, tail stiff, nose to the ground, casting anxious glances back as if to make sure he was still there. The last streaks of daylight were sinking behind the tree line, leaving the forest in that strange half-light where every shadow felt alive. The wind rattled the bare branches, and somewhere in the distance an owl called, its voice hollow against the stillness. Daniel's boots sank into the wet earth, each step pulling him deeper into the dark. He didn't know why he hadn't just turned back. Maybe it was the look in the animal's eyes when it first appeared at his back gate, something raw, urgent, almost human in its desperation. The dog had shown up without warning an hour earlier, pacing in frantic circles outside, his shed growling low whenever he tried to shoo it away. When he stepped closer, it had bolted toward the old path that cut behind his property, pausing every few yards to wait for him. It wasn't just leading him somewhere, it was demanding he follow. And against every logical thought in his head, he did. Branches clawed at his jacket. The path narrowed to a tunnel of twisted limbs, the ground littered with damp leaves that gave off the scent of rotten rain. Daniel felt his pulse quicken. He'd walked this stretch as a kid with his brother, Aaron, but not in years, not since that day. He pushed the thought aside, fixing his eyes on the flash of the dog's tail ahead. The air was cooler now, heavier, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Then the animal stopped so abruptly that Daniel nearly stumbled over it. The dog stood perfectly still, ears pricked forward, staring into a thicket to the right of the path. "What is it?" Daniel's voice came out quieter than he intended. The dog didn't move. He stepped around it, pushing into the brush. A sudden gust swept through, shaking loose a few dead leaves that spiraled down in the fading light. At first he saw nothing, just the tangled roots of an old oak in a shallow depression in the earth. Then his eyes caught the edge of something, pale beneath the dirt, almost hidden beneath a layer of moss and fallen branches. Daniel crouched, brushing it clear with his fingers. His breath caught dot. It was wood, weathered, splintered and sunken into the ground. A board, no more than a foot wide, with faint etchings cut into its surface, marks worn thin by years of wind and rain. But still there if you looked closely. His fingers traced the grooves, and the shapes began to form into something unmistakable, a name. And as the fading light caught the carving, the letters came alive in his mind, clear and impossible. Aaron Cole. The air rushed from his lungs in a soundless exhale. His knees felt weak. The smell of damp soil and decaying leaves seemed to press in on him, and for a moment the forest felt utterly silent, as if the world itself had paused to watch him read. He hadn't known there was a grave here. He hadn't known there was anything here at all. They'd told him Aaron's body was never recovered, that the river had carried it away, that the search was over. That was 12 years ago. The dog let out a low, almost mournful whine and sat beside him, its head bowed. Daniel's mind swirled with questions, none of which had answers. Who had put this here? How long had it been here, hidden under dirt and roots? And why did this stray, this half-starved, nameless creature know where to lead him? He wanted to run, to turn away before the weight of it crushed him, but he couldn't. Something in him was rooted to the spot, drawn to the quiet truth. In the weathered wood, the finality of it. His hands shook as he brushed away more dirt, revealing the faint outline of a date beneath the name. It was worn almost to nothing, but he thought he could make out the year, the same year Aaron had disappeared. The wind rose again, cold enough to sting his cheeks, carrying with it the distant sound of water rushing over rocks. The same river that had taken his brother, the same river they'd searched for days, calling his name until their voices were raw. Daniel stood slowly, his eyes still fixed on the grave. The dog pressed against his leg as if to anchor him, its body trembling. For a long moment, Daniel simply stared into the darkening woods, feeling the weight of the years between then and now. Somewhere beyond the trees, night was settling in, but here, in this quiet, hidden corner of the forest, time felt frozen, as if Aaron had been waiting all along for someone to find him, and now, Daniel had. Yet, even as the first stars began to glimmer faintly through the branches, one thought burned clearer than all the others. Finding the grave was not the end, it was the beginning. Daniel stayed crouched over the grave for what felt like an eternity, his fingers still resting on the weathered wood. The cold had begun to settle deep into his bones, but it was the weight in his chest that kept him frozen. The dog hadn't moved, its eyes fixed on him with an expression that felt almost knowing. He wanted to speak, to demand answers from the empty air, but his voice was locked somewhere between disbelief and dread. A branch cracked behind him. The sound jolted through the stillness like a shot, and Daniel spun around, his heart hammering. The path he had come from was now swallowed in shadow, but he could just make out a figure standing a few yards away, half hidden by the trees. A man, stocky build, cap pulled low, hands shoved deep into a worn jacket. The stranger didn't move closer, didn't speak, just stood there, watching. "Who are you?" Daniel's voice was hoarse, but it carried. The man tilted his head slightly, as though assessing him, and then, without a word, turned and walked. deeper into the woods. Every instinct told Daniel to leave it alone, but the grave behind him was still fresh in his mind, the mystery of how it came to be here burning hotter than his fear. He stood, brushing dirt from his hands, and followed. The dog went with him without hesitation, trotting silently at his side. The stranger moved quickly, but never seemed to be in a hurry. Every time Daniel thought he had lost him, a flicker of movement through the trees pulled him onward. The forest grew denser, the air colder, and the sound of rushing water became louder until it was all Daniel could hear. Then the man stopped, standing at the edge of a steep drop where the river churned violently below. Daniel slowed his approach, the earth damp and treacherous beneath his boots. "Why are you here?" he called, trying to steady his voice. "Did you put that grave there?" The man finally turned to face him. In the fading light, Daniel could see his face lined, weathered, eyes dark and unreadable. He looked older than Daniel had expected, though something about his stance carried a strength that hadn't faded. "With age you shouldn't be here," the man said, his tone low and deliberate. "That place was meant to be left alone." Daniel stepped closer, anger beginning to push past the numbness. "That's my brother's name. That's his grave. You think I'm just going to walk away?" The man's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer immediately. He glanced at the dog, then back at Daniel. "Not every grave is a marker for the dead," he said finally. "Some are warnings." The words landed like a stone in Daniel's gut. Before he could respond, the man turned again, making his way down a narrow path that wound dangerously close to the cliff's edge. The dog followed him without looking back. Daniel hesitated, torn between the urge to chase the truth and the icy knot forming in his stomach. The river roared beneath him, the smell of damp earth and moss thick in the air. Finally, he stepped forward, his boots sinking into the muddy track. The path twisted downward until it leveled out near the riverbank, where the current was calmer but no less relentless. The man stopped near a cluster of boulders, his gaze fixed on the water. 12 years ago, he began, I saw him here. The current didn't take him, not like they said. He came out on the other side." Daniel's breath caught. "Then, where is he? Why didn't you?" "Because by the time I got to him," the man cut in, "he wasn't the same. He didn't want to be found, and if you value your life, you won't go looking." Daniel stared at him, his mind spinning. None of it made sense, not the grave, not the warning, not the strange certainty in the man's voice. The dog whined softly, pacing in tight circles near the water's edge, as if agitated by something Daniel couldn't see. The man's eyes followed the dog, then flicked back to Daniel. "You should take that animal and go home. Forget you ever saw me, forget you ever found that grave." And with that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the thickening darkness as silently as he'd appeared. Daniel stood there, the sound of the river filling his head, the damp air clinging to his skin. Forget he couldn't. Not now. Not after this. Something told him the grave was only the first piece, and whatever came next would not let him walk away untouched. Daniel stood in the dim light of the forest, staring at the weathered name carved into the wood, but the stillness didn't last. Somewhere behind him a dry branch snapped sharp and deliberate. He turned fast, heart kicking against his ribs, but saw nothing beyond the dense shadows between the trees. The dog was staring too, its body stiff, ears angled toward the sound. The quiet that followed wasn't the ordinary hush of evening. It was heavier, as if the forest had swallowed its own breath. He forced himself to look back at the grave, yet the feeling wouldn't leave him, the sense that someone else was there. His mind pulled up the words the sheriff had told him all those years ago. Accidents happen, currents are stronger than they look, some things you have to accept. But now, standing over a grave no one had ever mentioned, Daniel realized there had been a choice made here. Someone had buried his brother, someone who hadn't wanted the world to know. The dog let out a short bark, then bolted toward the undergrowth, on the far side of the clearing. Daniel followed instinctively, pushing through the thorns and brush. The ground dipped sharply and the smell of river water grew stronger. Just ahead, the dog stopped again, pawing at something half hidden beneath the roots of a leaning willow. Daniel knelt, brushing away soil and damp leaves until his fingers closed around something cold and metallic. It was a rusted padlock, broken at the hinge, still attached to a length of chain that disappeared into the ground. The chain led to a small, rotted wooden box buried shallowly as if hidden in haste. He dug it out, heart pounding, the wood crumbling in his hands as he pried it open. Inside, wrapped in oil-stained cloth, were a handful of objects: a tarnished wristwatch, a faded photograph of two boys standing beside a riverbank, and a small silver badge stamped with the county's emblem. His breath caught. The watch was Aaron's. He remembered it clearly, the scuff on the edge from when his brother had dropped it on the dock one summer. But the badge, that was different. That meant law enforcement. Someone from the search. Someone who should have been helping. The dog's low growl pulled him back to the present. From deeper in the woods came a faint rustling, then the crunch of footsteps, steady, unhurried, closing in. Daniel shoved the box into his jacket and rose slowly, scanning the dark between the trees. A figure emerged just beyond the reach of the last weak light, tall, shoulders hunched, a hat pulled low enough to hide most of the face. "You shouldn't be here," The voice was low, not quite threatening but edged with something that made the hairs on Daniel's arms rise. He didn't answer. His grip tightened around the rusted padlock still in his hand, his mind racing. If this person had known about the grave, had been coming here all along, then maybe they had answers. Or maybe they were the reason Aaron was here in the first place. The figure stepped closer, the crunch of their boots slow and deliberate. "Things get buried out here for a reason," they said, almost conversational. But the words carried the weight of a warning. Daniel felt the dog press against his leg, its body trembling but not retreating. The air between them was thick. Every sound magnified the river, the leaves shifting in the wind, the faint creak of the chain still dangling from his fingers. "You knew him," Daniel said finally, his voice low. It wasn't a question. The figure tilted their head slightly but didn't answer. Instead, they glanced toward the grave, then back to him. "Some truths don't help the living," they murmured, and then, as suddenly as they'd appeared, they turned and vanished into the shadows, their footsteps fading into the sound of the water. Daniel stood frozen for several moments, the dog's shallow breaths loud in the silence. When he finally turned back toward the grave, the light was nearly gone, and the air had a bite of early frost. He knew he couldn't leave now, not with the box in his jacket, not with the image of that hidden badge burned into his mind. This wasn't over. If anything, it had just begun. The dog started toward the path again, glancing back at him with the same insistence it had shown from the beginning. Daniel followed his every step, feeling heavier yet more certain. Somewhere ahead, in the growing dark, lay the rest of the truth, and he could no longer pretend he didn't want to find it. Daniel had not moved from the grave for what felt like hours. The darkness had closed in around him, swallowing the path back to his property. The dog stayed pressed to his side, shivering in the cold, though Daniel couldn't tell if it was from the night air or from something else it sensed in the earth beneath them. Every so often it would whine low, a sound that carried more weight than any bark or growl could. He should have gone back already. He knew the trail would be harder to navigate in the dark, that his flashlight was still sitting uselessly on the kitchen counter where he'd left it. But there was something pulling at him, something in the way the ground here felt undisturbed yet purposeful. A grave that was not meant to be found. Daniel crouched again and traced his fingers over the worn wood. The date still caught in the grooves of his memory, the year Aaron vanished. He could still remember the morning the search ended. The heavy silence in their mother's kitchen when the sheriff gave her the news. He had been 17 then, angry and restless, convinced there was more they hadn't told him. Now, staring at this forgotten marker in the middle of the forest, that same heat was rising in his chest again. The dog shifted suddenly, ears twitching toward the shadows. Daniel's head snapped up. The wind had stilled, and the forest seemed to listen with him. Then he heard it, faint, deliberate movement, not the rustle of leaves in the breeze, but the sound of footsteps somewhere in the dark. His first thought was that it could be a hunter, maybe even someone from the neighboring property. But as the steps drew closer, slow and steady, the thought began to root itself in his mind, one that carried more weight than fear. Whoever was out there might know about this place. The dog barked once, sharp and warning, before growling low in its throat. Daniel stepped back instinctively, his eyes scanning the dark shapes between the trees. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice stronger than he felt. For a moment there was no answer. Then, from beyond the reach of the last sliver of moonlight, a man's voice drifted back, low, raspy, and far too calm. "You shouldn't be here." Daniel's breath caught. The figure moved into view slowly, as though unafraid of the dog or of him. The man was tall, his shoulders broad beneath a worn canvas jacket, his face obscured by the shadow of a hood. There was something about the way he carried himself, not aggressive, not hurried, but certain. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears. "Do you know what this is?" He gestured toward the grave, his voice tight. The man didn't answer right away. He stepped closer, the faint glint of his eyes catching in the dark. "I know exactly what it is," he said finally, "and I know you should turn around and walk away before you learn more than you can live with." The words struck like a blow. Every muscle in Daniel's body was screaming to ask more, to demand answers, but his instinct kept him still. The dog pressed against his leg again, its growl deepening. "You put this here?" Daniel asked. The man's gaze lingered on him for a long moment, unreadable. Then he shook his head slowly. "No, but I was here when it was done." The forest seemed to shrink around them, the weight of his words pressing in like the cold. Daniel's throat tightened. "Then tell me what happened to my brother." The man stepped into the moonlight then, and Daniel saw the lines on his face weathered, but sharp with the kind of memory that didn't fade. His eyes were hard, but something flickered there, to regret maybe, or fear. "You really want the truth?" he asked quietly. "It's not what they told you, it's not what anyone told you." Daniel felt his chest tighten. The man glanced, once at the grave, then back at him. "But once you know, there's no going back." The silence that followed was heavier than the night itself. Somewhere in the trees, a branch snapped. The dog's ears flicked toward the sound, but its body stayed rigid at Daniel's side. Daniel swallowed hard, then started talking. The man's eyes narrowed slightly, as if weighing something, before he stepped closer. His next words came, almost in a whisper, but they cut through the dark like a knife. Your brother didn't drown. The words hung in the air, heavier than the night around them. Daniel felt them sink into him, slow and cold, until his breath seemed caught somewhere deep in his chest. The man didn't look away. His eyes were steady, but there was something else in them now, a weight that came from having carried the truth too long. Daniel's voice was barely more than a whisper. Then what happened? The man stepped closer, the leaves beneath his boots barely making a sound. Your brother ran, he said. Not from the river, not from an accident, from someone. His gaze flicked to the grave, then back. We thought we could hide him, keep him safe, but we were too late. The forest seemed to close in, every shadow stretching closer. Daniel's mind spun with questions, with images of Aaron that no longer fit the story he'd been told. Why here? He asked. Why bury him here? The man's jaw tightened, because this was the only place left that still felt like his. He came here as a boy, didn't he? By the old path, with you. Daniel's throat closed at the memory. He and Aaron, barefoot in summer, racing to this very bend in the trail, making up stories about the crooked oak and the little clearing where the sun broke through the leaves. Aaron had called it their place. Daniel hadn't thought about it in years. Now it felt like a blade turning in his chest. I couldn't mark it proper, the man said quietly. Too many questions if someone found it, I thought. Maybe no one ever would. The dog shifted beside Daniel, breaking the stillness with a soft whine. The man glanced at it, a faint, almost bitter smile crossing his face. That dog, it belonged to him, used to follow him everywhere. I don't know how it found you. Maybe it knew you needed to see this. Daniel felt the ground tilt under him. The dog pressed against his leg again, its ribs sharp under his hand, its eyes fixed on him as if waiting for something only he could give. He wanted to ask more names, reasons, the pieces of the story that still didn't fit, but the man's expression had shifted. The look in his eyes was final. I've said what I can, he murmured. The rest you'll have to live with. Before Daniel could speak, the man turned and melted back into the dark, his footsteps swallowed by the forest. The stillness that followed was deafening. Daniel stayed by the grave for a long while, staring at the weathered wood, his breath clouding in the cold. The moonlight caught in the worn letters, making them shine faintly against the earth. He thought of all the years he'd believed his brother was gone without a trace, lost to the river. How many birthdays had passed with no place to stand and remember him? How many nights had he replayed the same questions in his mind, never knowing there was an answer, even one as bitter as this? The dog lay down beside the grave, curling against the dirt as though settling in for the night. Daniel knelt and rested his hand on its side, feeling the slow, steady rise and fall of its breath. He didn't know what he was supposed to do now, whether to call someone, to dig deeper, or to leave it as it was. But for the first time in 12 years, he felt something shift. The waiting was over. He whispered his brother's name. The sound almost lost to the trees. The wind carried it away, threading it through the branches, and for a moment he imagined it reaching somewhere far beyond this place. When he finally rose, the dog followed without hesitation, keeping to his side as they retraced the path through the dark. The forest was silent except for the crunch of their steps, the air sharp with the smell of wet leaves and cold earth. Daniel didn't look back until the trees thinned and the faint lights of his house glowed through the clearing. Only then did he turn. The grave was hidden again in the shadows, swallowed by the forest, but he knew exactly where it lay, and he knew he would return not to search for answers, but to make sure his brother was never forgotten again. As he stepped into the light, the dog pressed closer and Daniel rested his hand on its head. For 12 years he had carried the weight of not knowing. Tonight, that weight had changed. It wasn't lighter, but it was no longer empty. It was something he could hold on to. And as the door closed behind them, he understood that the forest hadn't just given him the truth. It had given him a place to bring his brother home.